They never said the word submission. They didn't need to. The demand arrived disguised as paperwork, thin, polite, almost fragile. A letter that didn't threaten, didn't shout, didn't accuse. It smiled. It thanked me for my continued cooperation. It spoke in the language of order, of community standards, of mutual respect. But beneath the softness was something far more precise and far more dangerous. This wasn't about rules. It was about power. If you've ever felt pressure that didn't leave bruises but still changed how you lived, stay with this story. The first notice was small, almost forgettable. A line item about a visual inconsistency. No fine, no deadline, just a request. That word, request, was chosen carefully. It suggested choice where none actually existed. It created the illusion that compliance was voluntary, that disagreement was welcome, that this was a conversation. It wasn't. I corrected the issue within 48 hours. I took photos. I emailed proof. I expected silence. That's how compliance usually works. You fix the thing, the system moves on to someone else. Instead, the second letter came. Different wording, same tone, another observation, another request. Still no fine, still no accusation. Just enough repetition to establish a rhythm. A pattern. A reminder that someone was watching, measuring, documenting. That was the moment the rules stopped being the point. The violations weren't escalating, but the attention was. It began to feel personal in a way bureaucracy rarely does. Not emotional, calculated. Like a chess player advancing pawns not to win immediately, but to control the board. Each letter reduced my options. Each correction trained a response. Fix, explain, apologize, repeat. They never acknowledged my compliance. That was deliberate. Acknowledgement would have closed the loop. Closure would have implied fairness. Instead, silence followed by another notice. Always calm, always professional, always vague. It created unease without outrage. That's the hallmark of soft coercion. Never give the target a clear enemy. When I asked for clarification, the response arrived 2 weeks later. 2 full weeks, long enough to keep me uneasy, short enough to avoid scrutiny. The reply thanked me for my engagement and assured me the board was acting within its authority. No specifics, no answers, authority. That word appeared for the first time there, tucked neatly into the middle of a paragraph like a badge briefly flashed and then hidden again. I started keeping records. Every letter, every envelope, every timestamp. Not because I planned to fight, but because something inside me recognized the shape of what was happening. This wasn't enforcement. It was conditioning. They didn't want resistance. They wanted anticipation. Soon, I was scanning my property the way they must have, searching for imperfections before they did. I trimmed things that weren't mentioned, adjusted things that had never been a problem. I began enforcing rules on myself more strictly than anyone had ever enforced them on me. That's when I realized the system was working. No fines had been issued, no hearings scheduled, no threats made. And yet my behavior had changed completely. My routines, my spending, my peace. Power doesn't need to be loud if it's constant. The third notice arrived by email instead of mail. That shift mattered. It meant urgency without escalation. Digital communication feels faster, closer, harder to ignore. The subject line read, follow-up observation. Observation, not violation, not warning. Observation implies objectivity, neutrality, surveillance without emotion. It listed 3 items this time. 2 were laughably minor. One was something that had been explicitly approved years earlier. When I pointed that out, the response was instant. Instant responses were new. "We'll review the record," they said. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." The items stayed on the list. That was the day the message became unmistakable. Facts were irrelevant. History was optional. Compliance wasn't about correctness, it was about posture. Submit first. Clarify later. Friends told me to ignore it. "They can't do anything without fining you," they said. "They're just fishing." They were wrong. Fishing implies randomness. This was targeted. I was the only one receiving notices at this frequency. I confirmed it quietly. Casually, the answers came back vague, uncomfortable. People didn't want to say it outright, but they didn't have to. The pressure wasn't shared. It was isolated. Isolation is strategic. It prevents collective pushback. It makes the target doubt their own interpretation. If no one else is complaining, maybe the problem is you. That doubt is the real weapon. The board never raised their voice. They never used threatening language. They never crossed a line that could be easily quoted or challenged. Everything was deniable, professional, reasonable. That's what made it so effective. Each interaction forced me to choose between time, money, and dignity. Responding required effort. Ignoring felt dangerous. Pushing back risked escalation. And escalation, I was learning, didn't look like fines or lawsuits. It looked like persistence. The rules became a moving target. One interpretation replaced another without acknowledgement. Precedents dissolved. Emails contradicted earlier emails, and every contradiction landed in my lap to resolve. That's how power shifts responsibility downward. They weren't enforcing order, they were exporting uncertainty. At night, I replayed the language in my head, tried to decode it, tried to predict the next move. The stress wasn't explosive, it was erosive. Slow, quiet, effective. I started to understand something unsettling. If they fined me, I could fight. If they sued me, I could defend. If they threatened me, I could expose them. But this was psychological leverage disguised as administration. No villain. No courtroom. No moment of impact. Just a steady narrowing of acceptable behavior until the only safe option was obedience. Not compliance. Submission. And the most dangerous part, they never had to ask for it. They never told me I was in trouble. That was the trick. Everything about the process insisted I was still safe, still respected, still in good standing. Every message opened with courtesy. Every sentence ended with gratitude. The language was so calm it felt almost benevolent. But the space around that language, the timing, the silence, the repetition, began to tighten like a vice. This wasn't confrontation. It was containment. If you've ever been cornered without being accused, keep watching. The escalation didn't come with louder words. It came with more procedures. A review cycle was introduced. Then a secondary review. Then a reminder that reviews were ongoing. Nothing concrete. Nothing actionable. Just a persistent sense that I was under evaluation, that my status was provisional, that my standing depended on continued cooperation. They never told me what would satisfy them. That uncertainty was intentional. When systems want compliance, they define success. When they want submission, they keep the goalposts moving. It ensures dependence. You can't finish a test if you don't know the questions. I asked, again, for a comprehensive list. All current concerns, everything at once. I framed it carefully, professionally, politely. I made it easy for them to say yes. They didn't. Instead, I received a reply thanking me for my interest in transparency and assuring me that issues would be communicated as they arise. That sentence rewired the power dynamic completely. They controlled the timeline. They controlled the information. I controlled nothing. From that moment on, I lived in a state of permanent readiness. Every sound outside felt like inspection. Every change in weather felt like risk. I stopped making improvements because improvements invite scrutiny. I stopped asking questions because questions invite attention. Silence became a survival strategy. That's when I noticed the subtle social consequences. Neighbors who used to wave now nodded, then stopped. Conversations shortened. People avoided specifics. No one said anything openly hostile, but no one wanted to be associated with a problem. And I had become a problem without being named one. This is how administrative pressure bleeds into social pressure. The system doesn't need to threaten you publicly. It just needs to signal privately. A look, a note, a suggestion that cooperation is appreciated and resistance is remembered. Soon, I wasn't just managing compliance. I was managing perception. I dressed differently when checking the mail. I timed my activities to avoid visibility. I rehearsed explanations for things no one had asked about yet. My life began to orbit around hypothetical violations. That's when the emails started referencing patterns. Not violations. Patterns. Patterns imply intent. They suggest behavior rather than incidents. And behavior, once framed, becomes character. The language was still polite, but now it carried implication. A sense that I wasn't just non-compliant, I was difficult. Not malicious. Just concerning. That label never appeared in writing. It didn't need to. I tried another approach, documentation. I sent photos with timestamps, receipts, old approvals, screenshots of prior correspondence. I treated it like a case file, hoping clarity would reset the relationship. It backfired. The response grew colder, shorter, less explanatory, as if my preparedness itself was suspicious, as if evidence was resistance. That's when I understood the unspoken rule. Participation was acceptable only if it flowed one way. I was allowed to receive information. I was not encouraged to produce it. They introduced legal review into the conversation casually, almost offhandedly. Not as a threat, as a process, a neutral safeguard, a reminder that everything was being handled properly. The word legal changes everything. It freezes people, it shuts down debate. It reframes power as inevitability. Once something is under legal review, questioning it feels reckless, dangerous. And yet, still no fines, no charges, no hearings, just pressure. I started losing sleep. Not because of fear, exactly, but because of vigilance. My nervous system never powered down. I was waiting for the next notice, the next observation, the next polite message that would quietly rearrange my priorities. This is the cost of ambiguous authority. It keeps you alert but never resolved. You're always reacting, never resting. Friends told me to just comply fully. They didn't understand that I already was. Compliance wasn't the issue. Compliance was the baseline. What they wanted was consent to dominance. The tone shifted again. This time, they framed their communication as concern. We want to work with you. Our goal is harmony. We appreciate your efforts. That language sounds supportive until you realize what's missing. Reciprocity. They never adjusted their behavior, never acknowledged inconsistencies, never apologized for errors. Cooperation was expected from me, not practiced by them. Harmony, it turned out, meant alignment with authority. I requested a meeting. That took 3 weeks to schedule. When it finally happened, it was brief, procedural, and strangely hollow. Faces on a screen, notes being taken, no decisions made, no resolutions offered. Just reminders of policy and assurances that everything was being handled appropriately. I left with nothing new except confirmation that the system was functioning exactly as designed. It wasn't broken. It was optimized. Optimized to exhaust without exploding, to pressure without provoking, to dominate without documenting. That's when the notices paused. No emails, no letters, no observations. At first, the silence felt like relief. Then it became something else entirely. Suspension is its own form of control. When communication stops without closure, the threat doesn't disappear, it multiplies. You don't know if the storm passed or if it's gathering. I waited. Weeks passed, then months. I almost convinced myself it was over. And that's when the final shift began, quietly, decisively, moving from psychological pressure to something far more dangerous. Not punishment, positioning. And by the time I recognized it, the groundwork had already been laid. The silence wasn't mercy. It was preparation. Nothing teaches obedience faster than uncertainty, and nothing conceals intent better than patience. While I waited, while I hoped, the system recalibrated around me, quietly, methodically, without my input. When the next message finally arrived, it didn't mention the past. No reference to earlier notices. No acknowledgement of compliance, documentation, or meetings. It read like a clean slate. That should have comforted me. Instead, it terrified me. The language had changed. It was no longer observational. It was procedural. References to standards, precedent, and administrative consistency appeared where courtesy once lived. The warmth was gone, not replaced by hostility, but by inevitability. This wasn't a conversation anymore. It was a conclusion unfolding. If you've ever realized too late that the rules changed while you were still playing fair, stay with me. They introduced a deadline, the first real one, framed as routine, non-negotiable. A date that existed not to resolve anything but to anchor authority. Deadlines force hierarchy. Whoever sets them controls the pace and the outcome. I responded immediately, calmly, carefully. I asked what would happen if the deadline wasn't met, not defiantly, practically. The reply took 4 days. 4 days is an eternity when power is asymmetric. When the response came, it didn't answer the question. It didn't need to. It referenced policy. It referenced procedure. It referenced consequences without naming them. That was the moment I understood. Escalation had already occurred. I just hadn't been notified in human terms. The system had shifted from influence to enforcement without announcing the transition. No siren, no warning, just a subtle repositioning where I was now behind the line instead of in front of it. I sought legal advice. That's when the architecture revealed itself. The attorney listened, nodded, took notes, asked for documents. When I finished, they leaned back and said something that changed everything. Nothing here is technically improper. That word, technically, is the shield systems hide behind. Every step had been small enough to justify, every delay plausible, every inconsistency defensible. The pattern was obvious to a human, but invisible to a checklist. They hadn't broken the law. They had mastered its margins. Legal harassment doesn't look like aggression. It looks like process. It uses patience as a weapon and ambiguity as cover. By the time harm is visible, responsibility is diffused across emails, committees, and timelines. No one is accountable because everyone followed procedure. The deadline arrived. I complied again, fully, thoroughly, beyond what was asked. I submitted more than required, hoping excess would demonstrate good faith. It was received without comment. Days later, I was informed the matter would proceed to review, not resolution. Reviews don't end things, they extend them. At that point, the emotional cost had already been paid. My routines were altered. My sense of safety eroded. My reputation quietly reframed. Even if the issue vanished tomorrow, the damage had already settled in. That's the part no policy acknowledges. Power that never explodes still leaves wreckage. The final notice didn't accuse me of anything. It didn't need to. It cited standards and concluded that ongoing non-alignment had been noted. That phrase, ongoing non-alignment, was brilliant in its vagueness. It couldn't be disproven. It didn't reference a single act. It described a state of being. I wasn't violating rules. I was failing to conform. The recommended path forward involved increased oversight, more frequent reviews, additional documentation, continued engagement. In other words, submission formalized. That was the endgame all along. Not punishment, not compliance, control. By stretching the process, they ensured fatigue. By avoiding confrontation, they avoided resistance. By keeping everything legal, they ensured immunity. I could fight, but only at great cost. Financially, emotionally, socially. And even then, victory would be narrow. A technical win inside a system designed to outlast me. So I made a different choice. I disengaged, not by surrendering, but by documenting, withdrawing emotionally, and reclaiming what I could. I stopped expecting fairness from a structure that wasn't built to provide it. I stopped negotiating with a process that mistook obedience for harmony. The power didn't disappear, but it lost something critical, my consent. That's the part systems never account for. They assume endurance equals acceptance. They mistake silence for agreement. They confuse legality with legitimacy. But submission isn't the same as peace. And compliance, when demanded without limits, becomes a warning sign, not of order, but of control. This wasn't a story about rules. It was a lesson in power dynamics, how authority doesn't need to crush you to own you. It just needs to stay polite long enough for you to change yourself. And once you see that, you never unsee it. Because the most dangerous systems aren't the ones that punish dissent. They're the ones that make resistance feel pointless.